Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something that's pretty heavy, but also super fascinating. We're going to be talking about the opioid crisis here in America. And specifically, we're going to be looking at the role of the Sackler family. They're the dynasty behind Purdue Pharma, and of course the drug OxyContin. And we're going to be trying to figure out how they played a role in all of this.
Yeah, it's pretty wild to think about, like, how could just one family have such a huge impact on the health of a whole country? But that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today.
It is, and to do that, we're going to be digging into a really awesome book. It's called Empire of Pain, and it's by Patrick Radden Keefe. And it does a really incredible job of kind of pulling back the curtain on the Sacklers.
Yeah.
So we're not just talking about a company here, we're talking about a whole family.
Yeah.
And we're talking about their ambition and, frankly, some pretty questionable tactics that they used.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This story isn't just about corporate greed. It's about a family legacy. And it all starts with this guy, Arthur Sackler. He was the patriarch of the family. And he was honestly kind of brilliant. He was a doctor and he was a marketing whiz. And he completely changed the way that pharmaceuticals were advertised.
Yeah, he was already pushing the boundaries back in the 50s and 60s. What's crazy is that he was one of the first people to see doctors as the customers. His idea was if you get the doctors on board, they're the ones that are going to write the prescriptions. So he really went all in on these really elaborate campaigns, using persuasive language, even medical journals, to promote the products that he was selling.
And you know what? It worked. His whole approach with drugs like Valium was seen as groundbreaking back then. He basically wrote the playbook that we see for modern pharmaceutical marketing. But those same tactics, the focus on persuasion and the downplaying of the risks, well, they laid the groundwork for everything that happened later with OxyContin.
It's almost like he set the stage, but then his brothers, Mortimer and Raymond Sackler, they took it to a whole new level. They inherited Purdue Pharma, and under their leadership, OxyContin became a blockbuster drug. But as the book reveals, it wasn't all good.
No, it definitely wasn't. Purdue really pushed this narrative that OxyContin was this miracle drug, that it was a less addictive solution for dealing with pain. But Keefe's book really digs deep, and it shows that those claims about the low risk of addiction, well, they were based on, let's just say, some pretty flimsy evidence.
It seems like they were really capitalizing on this growing fear of undertreated pain in America.
Yeah.
They basically said, hey, look, we have the answer. OxyContin is the cure-all. And they didn't just target doctors. They went straight to the patients, too.
Oh, absolutely. You remember those ads from the late 90s? They were everywhere. Purdue really tapped into this idea that people were suffering and they didn't have to be. That doctors were too afraid to prescribe the strong painkillers that people needed. It was a masterful marketing campaign, but it was also incredibly troubling.
So how did they get this so-called miracle drug into the hands of so many people? What were some of the tactics that they were using?
Well, picture this. A massive sales force with thousands of reps, and they were all trained to downplay the risks of addiction. And they were all pushing OxyContin for just about any type of pain you could imagine. They even had this patient coupon program where you could get a free 30-day supply. Can you imagine that? It's like they were giving away candy.
A free 30-day supply of a strong opioid like that. That's just mind-blowing. It's like they were almost begging people to become addicted.
Yeah, it really is. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Keefe's book details how they were targeting specific doctors, the ones that were known to prescribe a lot of painkillers. And they would shower these doctors with gift strips, even funding for research.
So they were really playing the system and working all the angles. But how did this aggressive marketing actually play out in the real world? What was the human cost of all of this?
I mean, just think about it. You've got this company, and they're flooding the market with this drug that's super addictive. They're downplaying the risks, and they're actively encouraging doctors to prescribe it for anything. I mean, it was a recipe for disaster.
And it really was a disaster. You had all these people who started taking OxyContin for real pain, and they ended up addicted. They needed higher and higher doses and longer prescriptions.
Yeah.
And tragically, some of them turned to even stronger opioids or heroin.
It's just heartbreaking. The book does a really good job of bringing those individual stories to life. You see how this epidemic just tore through families and destroyed communities, and so many lives were ruined.
The human cost is just unbelievable. It's easy to focus on the numbers, but we have to remember behind every single one of those statistics is a real person and a family whose lives were shattered.
And here's the really disturbing part. Even as the evidence was piling up showing how addictive OxyContin was, even as the number of overdose deaths started to go through the roof, the Sacklers just kept pushing the drug. They kept saying that it was safe and that the benefits were worth the risk.
When you read about all of this, it's hard not to be angry. They knew the risks. They saw what was happening. And they still put profits ahead of people's lives.
And it's interesting because while this was all happening, while they were building this empire of pain, they also started to build this empire of philanthropy. I mean, they were donating millions of dollars to museums, universities, all these prestigious institutions.
It's kind of ironic when you think about it. Their wealth, all of this money that they made from the suffering of all these people, it was being used to fund all this art and culture. It's almost like they were trying to buy a legacy of good deeds.
Right. And it really makes you wonder, were these donations genuine? Did they actually care? Or was it just a way to try and deflect criticism and protect their reputation?
I mean, it definitely worked for a while. The Sackler name became associated with things like art and philanthropy, not addiction and all the death that was happening. But you can't hide from the truth forever.
You really can't. And eventually the lawsuits started to come. States started to try and hold Purdue accountable for the damage that OxyContin had caused. And that's when things got really interesting.
Yeah, this is where the story gets even more complicated.
Yeah.
Because while all of this was happening, all this legal action, the Sacklers were busy trying to protect all of their money. They moved billions of dollars into family trusts to make it harder for anyone to get to it.
It was a really clever legal strategy, even if it was kind of morally questionable. They were basically shielding their personal fortunes while their company was crumbling, all under the weight of all these lawsuits.
Now, what happened in the end? Did they actually face any real consequences?
Well, Purdue eventually filed for bankruptcy, and they reached a settlement with the Department of Justice. They agreed to pay billions of dollars in fines, but
There's always a but, isn't there?
there is. The family members themselves were never charged with any crimes, and even with the fines, they still walked away with most of their fortune.
So it's kind of a hollow victory when you think about it.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars in fines, but no admission of guilt. And no real accountability for the people who caused all of this.
It definitely leaves you with this uneasy feeling, this sense that justice wasn't really served.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Right.
This deep dive into the Sacklers and OxyContin has been heavy, but it's also been really insightful. What are
Yeah.
the key takeaways?
Yeah, it really gets you thinking, doesn't it, about how much power these companies have and the influence of all that wealth and how easily people can manipulate the system.
It is a cautionary tale. You know, the Sackler story is unique in a lot of ways, but it shows us some really big problems that go way beyond just the pharmaceutical industry.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, it makes you wonder how these things can happen in the first place.
Yeah.
How can a company knowingly sell something that's dangerous and get away with it for so long?
It's crazy, right? It really is. And the way they do it is by tapping into our fears and our desires. Think about it. Purdue took this very basic human need, the need for pain relief, and they twisted it. They exploited the trust we have in doctors and the whole healthcare system.
That's what's so messed up about all of this. It wasn't just about making money. It was about controlling the whole story. They wanted to change how people saw things, how they thought about pain and addiction.
Exactly. They created this whole culture around pain management, and they made it seem like opioids were the only answer. And they did it all with a smile on their faces, you know. Donating to charities, sponsoring events, while their drug was destroying lives all over the country.
Where do we go from here? I mean, we're still dealing with this opioid crisis even now.
Well, I think the biggest thing we can learn from this is that we all need to be a lot more critical, a lot more skeptical. We can't just take things at face value, especially when it's coming from powerful people who want to sell us something, whether it's a pill or a product or even just an idea.
It's like that saying, follow the money, right? Who's making money from this? What are they trying to get out of it? And what could happen?
Yeah, exactly. We have to be aware of all the ways people try to influence us, the ways they try to change how we think and how we act.
So it's about being informed. It's about doing our own research and asking the tough questions.
Yeah.
And maybe not being so quick to believe all those fancy marketing campaigns.
Exactly. The Sackler story is a reminder that we can't just sit back and assume everything is fine. We all have to be informed and engaged, and we have to hold the people in power accountable.
This has been a tough conversation, but a really important one. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the opioid crisis and the Sackler family. It's a wild story, and I think it's one that we can all learn from.
I agree. And remember, this is just one piece of a much bigger issue. So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep thinking critically about the world around you.
That's great advice. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.